Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and politics is essentially all about controlling how an argument is phrased in order to win said argument. In this video, I've been quite fascinated by an article in the Telegraph which illustrates this concept perfectly, I think, in terms of how they are trying to win an argument on easing the lockdown. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, bit of background. So in terms of the coronavirus lockdown, there are, of course, two factors that people include when considering to what extent they are in favour of which measures. One is the extent to which they may save lives, and two, the economic impact of them. And in some people's minds, it is a pull between the two. Now, we know now that the lockdown was delayed by at least 2 weeks in the UK. Now, some may think that this is because the Conservative government were wrangling over the impact it would have had on the economy. And in the case of some ministers, absolutely, this is certainly true. But in the case of the likes of Boris Johnson and a few others, it's really a libertarian view, as Americans would understand it. A lockdown is the ultimate example of a government controlling the population's day-to-day lives. It strikes at the heart of what these people consider freedom to be. But there was no way that these people could justify opposing the lockdown on the basis that it meant they couldn't go to the hairdressers or to a pub. So they focused on lives or the economy, depending on which one they thought their audience cared most about. But in reality, the concerns of these people was haircuts and gin and tonics. So to those who cared about lives, they would argue one of two ways. One, it's just a bit of flu. Don't worry about it. And this argument struggles a little bit after tens of thousands of deaths, but they're still using it on a certain audience. The second one is that actually you'll find it will cost even more lives because people will just die of other conditions by not being able to get hospital treatment. Of course, a number of people inevitably have died from other conditions, but that's the result of our NHS not having the capacity to cope. Bear in mind that tens of thousands of even COVID patients were discharged from hospital while they were still technically COVID patients. In other words, they had not been cleared as free of the virus. But let's say your audience aren't that bothered about saving lives because they don't believe their own is in that much jeopardy. So then they talk about the economy. Now, thinking they're on safer ground here, they just point out the fact that the lockdown means lower productivity and therefore a hit to the economy. And the problem is that the economic impact is not quite what most people imagine, but perception is everything in politics. So how you frame the argument is vital. And this is what the Telegraph are now saying. And it's quite a clever way to go around a debate. So their latest article on it doesn't seem to suggest that the lockdown was a bad idea from the start, even though they were dead against it from the start. No, they've lost that argument, so they abandoned that, no problem. So you change what the argument is, that's how you win a debate. So what they now say is the lockdown was cocked up by the government. Now bear in mind that the Telegraph abandoned support for Boris Johnson over a month ago, so they're not constrained by having to try and argue one way while still trying to cover for his ineptitude. But they still want the lockdown gone. Even though it's actually hard to think of too many restrictions that are still in place right now. Ironically, I think the only things you can't do now is get a haircut and go out for a gin and tonic. But like I said, that's what they really hate about it anyway. So they must have even those restrictions lifted. So what they did was to concede that there were good reasons to have the lockdown in place. They accept that there are arguments which suggest lifting it too soon or too quickly will actually cause greater economic harm than not having the lockdown at all. But this is no good, so what are they going to do to argue against it? Simple. Most people haven't read the arguments, the economic arguments that is, so they simply make up what they are. So they describe two economic arguments for keeping the lockdown in place that aren't actually valid, show how weak they are, and then win the argument, because then people are forced to come to the conclusion, well, there isn't really any good reason to keep the lockdown. Naturally, you don't mention the real argument. So what they mentioned was one line of thinking they say is if you ease it too soon, then you're going to have to go back into a lockdown and you extend the economic damage. But that is not one of the economic arguments. In fact, doesn't even make sense. We know that the government have now positioned themselves into a situation where it is impossible to go back into lockdown. Can't do it. Not only won't it be politically possible, but the government have lost any trust amongst the public, so people simply won't comply even if they try. The second argument, they say, is that people won't change their behaviour when lockdown is removed for fear of the virus. Again, I've not seen any intelligent economists making this argument because it's brainless. If people didn't change their behaviour, there'd be no need for the lockdown. It's not a reason to keep a lockdown in place. So what you're doing is to propose two arguments that even a Telegraph reader has the intelligence to dismiss and therefore win the argument. But what it ignores is how easing the lockdown too soon actually does impact businesses and therefore the economy. Because what the paper really is ignoring is productivity. That's what impacts the strength of your economy. Now, what is the difference between someone not being productive because they're furloughed at home, because of the lockdown, or if they're at home anyway because they're either too ill to work or they've been told to isolate? I mean, none at all. So the easing of the lockdown, before we had the rate of infection under control, that is what is going to happen. You're still going to have a lower amount of productivity than before the pandemic. And for small businesses, it's going to be devastating and could well finish them off, because when you only employ a small workforce, if you've got even a member of staff off at any one time, quite a lot, you can't afford that. But by risking the rate of infections to balloon up again, and bear in mind, I say balloon up again as if it's really low now, it's still really high now. It's lower than it was. But compared to countries that are tentatively coming out of lockdown, it's still very, very high. And also countries, bear in mind, that are not doing economically as badly with their lockdown as we have. But like I say, by risking the infection ballooning up again, and also ironically by having a tracing program at last, you'll see that there are lots of workers unable to go to work through either illness from the virus, or in most cases, because remember the vast majority of people who contract the virus are asymptomatic, so in most cases people having to stay at home because of this, it'll be because they've been told to isolate by the tracing program. And isolating is a legal requirement, not guidance. You don't get to go, well, I'm not going to, and your boss doesn't get to lean on you either. It is a legal requirement that you isolate. And, sure, this is the thing from the Telegraph. Don't mention that. Don't mention it. Change what the argument actually is. Pretend to be a balanced observer and make a balanced argument. Well, these are the arguments for and these are the arguments against. And what you do is you make sure that the arguments against are so weak that they wouldn't fool a 6-year-old, and that's how you win at politics. So just a little bit of interest there. Hope you found it interesting as I did. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.